Hey, RetconRaider here with yet another video about Phoenix Point, the spiritual successor to the original XCOM trilogy. I've already talked about the current crowdfunding campaign, the possible enemies we might face, and the apparent nature of the Pandora virus. So this time I thought I'd talk about the game's 5 factions and the planned faction mechanics. So let's dive right in, shall we? Next to the mutation system, one of the biggest defining aspects of Phoenix Point is what looks to be a fairly robust faction system. The game will feature 5 main factions: the player-controlled Phoenix Project, the mutated legions of the Pandora virus, the virus-worshipping cultists known as the Disciples of Anu, the militant soldiers of New Jericho, and the enigmatic scientists of Sin Darion, occasionally spelled as Sinedrion. As the campaign progresses, each of these factions will have its own goals and will steadily work toward accomplishing these goals. The player has the option of working with or against each of the human-led factions, which will influence how the Phoenix Project develops, and may ultimately determine how the game ends. The player can take a neutral diplomatic approach for a time, trading with all 3 of the factions, at least for a while, but this will eventually become impossible as the factions push forward with their mutually exclusive goals. There are definite advantages to working with another faction. Each faction has its own unique technology, its own special personnel, and its own idea on how to save humanity. Once a player has allied with one of these factions, they will slowly gain access to these unique technologies and personnel, while also unlocking special missions that can lead to that faction's special game ending. In the early game, the other factions will start approaching you with various missions, such as requesting your assistance in defending their havens from aliens or other factions. They'll offer to reward you with resources or exclusive technologies, and as you build your reputation with a faction, they may even agree to provide you with regular shipments of supplies or even unique personnel. In a recent interview with Unstable Voltage, Julian Gollop brought up a specific example, suggesting that if you helped to defend a temple site belonging to the Disciples of Anu, they might reward you with a new recruit who has skills unique to that faction's Cult Priest class. In addition, that special recruit would also give you access to special cosmetic options that aren't normally available to your Phoenix Project operatives. Working closely with another faction will not only have a tangible effect on your technological growth, but also the skills and appearance of your soldiers. Of course, that's not to say that the only way to gain access to these technologies is through diplomacy. If the player wishes, they can instead forge their own path, taking what they need from other factions by force. But be warned, taking hostile action against a faction will invite hostility in return, and those factions may end up raiding your own outposts as well. Now, let's take a closer look at the 3 main NPC factions in Phoenix Point. First, we have New Jericho, known as the Human Confederation in some earlier promotional artwork. New Jericho is the most militant of the 3 factions, focused on saving humanity through the development of military technologies. They do not feel that it is enough to just survive, but instead yearn to take back the Earth, no matter the cost. Mechanically, allying with New Jericho would grant the player access to a wider array of conventional military technology, as well as research that would help with countering specific enemy mutations. In a recent update to the FIG campaign, Snapshot Games also revealed a concept design for an armored vehicle developed by New Jericho that the player might theoretically be able to gain access to. This thing can carry up to 8 soldiers at a time and has a single top-mounted turret to provide heavy fire support. Allying with the soldiers of New Jericho would also presumably grant the player access to their unique customization options, which appear to be heavily inspired by post-apocalyptic settings such as Mad Max and Fallout. Of course, working with New Jericho would not come without cost. They're human-first extremists and will almost certainly not play well with the other factions. On top of that, they would almost certainly turn on the Phoenix Project if the player decided to begin researching ways to mutate or otherwise genetically enhance their own soldiers. Story-wise, the New Jericho faction is led by Tobias West, a former major in the U.S. Army and the founder of Vanadium Inc., a security and technology firm founded in the 2020s. They were among the first to encounter the mutant spawned by the Pandora virus, and quickly grew as they were hired on as consultants by many of the world's governments that were struggling to handle the sudden outbreaks. Even after the downfall of civilization, his soldiers continue to spread his message of hope and resistance through widespread radio and video broadcasts. These messages, although risky, grant them access to a wide range of recruits whom they use to continue the development and deployment of innovative battlefield technologies. In comparison, the Disciples of Anu, originally known as Advena Domine, are the polar opposite of New Jericho. Essentially a doomsday cult, they worship something called the Dead God, and their most holy rituals involve using the Pandora virus to somehow induce mutations in their own followers. These changes are sometimes fatal, but they also appear to come without the risk of allowing the Pandora virus to mentally dominate the transformed cultist. Mechanically, the benefits of working with the disciples of Anu is obvious. It's the quickest way the player will be able to gain access to research that will allow them to mutate their own soldiers. This could provide an invaluable asset, essentially turning your soldiers into superhumans, but at the cost of diluting or even completely losing their humanity. It would also theoretically give the player access to unique cosmetic options for their own operatives, perhaps involving cultist adornment such as ornate robes or masks. Story-wise, the Disciples of Anu are a mystery. The Phoenix Project has been tracking their development since the 2020s when the Pandora virus first came into the public eye, but they note that any earlier records about the organization have been lost. The implication is that the Disciples of Anu have existed for a long time, and that discovering their true origin may end up playing a significant role in the game's storyline. Personally, I think it's important to note something from The Old Man of the Sea, one of the pieces of official fiction released on the main Phoenix Point website. I glossed over it in my last video, but in that story, the Viking infected in 787 AD did father a child after he began mutating. While his lover died due to her exposure to the Pandora virus, his child survived and was subsequently raised by the inhabitants of a nearby village. Over the ensuing centuries, his infected bloodline continued to propagate, with many of his descendants coming to visit him, almost as if they were making a pilgrimage. Even as late as the 20th century, his followers seem to have some sort of innate connection to their mutated ancestor. It is possible that this may be in some way related to the origin of the Disciples of Anu. It's also worth noting that the latest piece of official fiction, The Claimed Idol by Alan Stroud, specifically speaks of an ancient temple found somewhere deep in an unidentified jungle. The story, although short and rather vague, does specifically mention a strange statue of a robed figure with a face covered in organic fungal growths of an unearthly origin. This further reinforces the idea that the Disciples of Anu have been around for a long, long time. And then we have the Sin Darion. In many ways, the Sin Darion are neutral, striking a balance between the extremes presented by New Jericho and the Disciples of Anu. While they do wish to protect humanity, they are not intent on retaking the Earth at all costs, instead seeming content to find a way to coexist with the Pandora virus. To this end, they have developed incredibly advanced technologies, many of them defensive in nature, intended to help them establish well-secured havens that are all but impervious to the virus and the mutants it spawns. Mechanically, the advantages of working with the Sin Darion are also obvious. They're developing technology that will allow them to repel the microbial mist, which would be invaluable for protecting Phoenix Project outposts and personnel. They would also apparently provide access to new types of research that focus on understanding how the Pandora virus and the mutant hybrids function. Working with the Sin Darion would also presumably grant the player access to their unique cosmetic options, such as their futuristic clean suits, as befitting their lofty scientific demeanor. Story-wise, the Sin Darion are anarchistic social ecologists who believe that everyone has a right to exist on Earth, the Pandora virus included. Unlike the other factions, they are led by a committee with multiple leaders who all must come to a consensus before they will commit themselves to a new decision or course of action. Their core beliefs include ideals of personal freedom, inherent human rights, community sharing, the advancement of science and technology, and the idea that violence should only ever be used in self-defense. Julian Gollop himself has suggested that the Sin Darion may be the most realistic faction, willing to settle for coexistence with the aliens rather than risking everything to wipe them out. But he has also warned that the Sin Darion's apparent pacifistic nature will not last for long. And that brings us to the final faction, the Phoenix Project itself. Now, for the most part, there's not a lot to say here. The player will be responsible for guiding growth and development of his faction throughout the campaign, and it will presumably end up changing drastically depending on what factions the player decides to ally with and what story decisions the player decides to make. However, there are some constants involved, most notably the background behind the Phoenix Project. Initially, we knew very little about this organization, other than that it was a loose parallel to the XCOM organization in the XCOM franchise. The Phoenix Project is listed as a worldwide organization designed to be activated when the world is in peril. while also making mention that the organization relies on individual cells that operate independently of each other. Phoenix Point, the player's starting haven, is one of those independent cells. During an interview with IGN, Julian Gollop stated that the Phoenix Project was originally formed shortly after the Second World War, as an organization officially funded by the United Nations. It's also important to note that, although the Pandora virus first came into the public eye in 2022, the Phoenix Project was apparently aware of it as early as the 1970s. As established in the short story The Hatch, the Phoenix Project mounted 2 expeditions to the Moon, which ultimately culminated in an encounter with the Pandora virus in 1973, leading to the apparent death of 2 Phoenix Project operatives. They were also involved in interviewing a man who survived mental contact with a Pandora virus-related entity in the short story Far Out There, which also took place in the 1970s. It's also possible that the Boston Expedition incident in 1936 directly resulted in the formation of the Phoenix Project, since it's established that the expedition took place right before World War II, and the Phoenix Project was founded right after the war concluded. Unfortunately, despite this, it appears that the Phoenix Project was shut out of the United States in 1986 during an investigation by the Committee on Governmental Efficiency and Supplementary Projects. This committee ultimately decided to end financing for the project, which they accused of being the result of decades of careless spending based on either delusion or downright fraud that was potentially harmful to national security. It's possible that the Phoenix Project continued to operate in a more limited capacity afterwards, given that it was also funded by the United Nations, but there's no overt evidence of their activities until the 2020s, when they were presumably called upon to begin investigating the Pandora virus once more. Which leads directly to the beginning of the game, where the player is granted control of Phoenix Point and tasked with discovering the fate of other Phoenix Project cells, as well as salvaging whatever information or research those other cells have already gathered. And really, any further development after that point is entirely in the player's hands. But hey, thanks for listening to another one of my videos. I hope you found it entertaining or at least informative, and I hope you'll continue spreading the word about this great-looking tactical strategy game. Until next time, this is RetconRaider signing off. Oh, and don't forget, while I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can keep up with all the latest news by checking out the official website and the crowdfunding campaign page on the FIG website. Links are in the description.